Mystery Bible on watchers and listeners. This morning, you have your three fearless co-hosts, Joel and Dan and Brian, and we are very excited to be joined by a special guest this morning, Mr. Russ Breault. Mr. Russ Breault is an expert on the Shroud of Turin and has recently released a book called Shroud Encounter, Explore the World's Greatest Unsolved Mystery. We were just remarking that this is really interesting timing because on some really large news outlets, the Shroud of Turin has been getting a lot of attention as we have this recording. So it's on a lot of people's minds. And Russ and I had run into each other at a conference many weeks ago. And as soon as I saw what he was into, I said, we got to get this in front of our audience because this is such a fun topic. So Mr. Russ Breault, thanks so much for joining Mystery Bible On. We're really excited to hear what you have to teach us about the Shroud of Turin today.
Well, thank you, Joel. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dan and Brian. I look forward to talking about my favorite topic.
All right. Well, for our listeners' perspective, I know that you have been researching and lecturing on the Shroud for over 30 years. I know that you have all kinds of presentations built around this. The book that you wrote, if you want to hold it up and wave it in the air so our audience can see what it looks like, the book you wrote is not, it's not a pamphlet. It's a lengthy book. And I can't wait to get my hands on it. So we're really looking forward to this. This is not something that I know a lot about. I tend to read and click on a news article when it comes up. I've probably seen a short documentary. I've heard some of the rumors and misinformation out there. So this is going to be really fun to hear your in-depth perspective on what's going on with the Shroud of Turin. So if you don't mind, I want to just kind of start off with a broad question that you can orient our audience to what they need to know, and then we'll just organically jump in with our thoughts and ideas and questions and ignorance as we continue. So, Mr. Breault, you are an expert on the Shroud of Turin. What does the Mystery Bible On audience need to know about the Shroud of Turin? And for some people, I don't want to assume that everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. So start at the most basic level. And if you don't mind giving us a few minutes on why this is such an important topic and what it's all about.
Well, let me just start off with in terms of what the Shroud is. It's a shroud, meaning a burial cloth that has wrapped a corpse. They've used burial shrouds for thousands of years all over the world. Of Turin, Shroud of Turin, Italy, where it's been kept since for the past 500 or so, not quite 500, since 1578. And prior to that, I was in France, and prior to that, it was in Turkey. But now this cloth is a long, narrow cloth. It's 14 feet long, yet only 3.5 feet wide. And it bears the faint image of a front and back image of a bearded, crucified man. And it's exceedingly faint, and it also bears has a whole pattern of blood stains that correlate with the wounds of crucifixion, specifically the wounds that are documented in all four gospel accounts. So, in other words, okay, we have an image of a crucified man here. How do you know it's Jesus? Well, then the only way you can answer that question is to look at it forensically. And so then you kind of see what happened to Jesus and how does it correlate with the shroud. You have 30 puncture wounds around the head from an apparent crown of thorns. That's the most unique and distinctive feature, because no one else, as far as we know, was given a crown of thorns as a routine of crucifixion. It was a singular mockery for the man who claimed to be king of the Jews. Then you also have nail wounds in the wrist. Well, that's interesting, because every medieval representation of the crucifixion shows the nail wound in the palm of the hand, but not with the shroud. It's in the wrist. And that's interesting because that's medically accurate. They did experiments back in the 1950s using cadavers, and found that if you nail a body up with through the palm, it's going to fall down. It's going to rip through the fleshy part in between the fingers. The only way that they could secure the body was to nail it through the wrist. Archaeological excavations in Jerusalem have found bone fragments with wrists with scratch marks where the nail went through the wrist. And so that's anatomically accurate. Now, it's also intriguing is that on the shroud, you see 4 fingers, but you see no thumbs. Now, why is that? Because when a nail penetrates the wrist, it partially cuts nerves and tendons and causes the thumbs to jerk into the center of the palm. And at either point where thumbs could be visible on the shroud, there are no thumbs visible. Then you have the fact that the body that is represented on the shroud has received a massive scourging. I mean, whipping, brutally whipped, and now usually those who were crucified, you either whipped and released as a form of punishment. That happened to Paul, maybe 5 times as we know of, and then or you were crucified as a form of execution. Now sometimes they might whip you if you're going to be crucified, but not very heavily, because the Romans wanted you to stay alive on the cross as long as possible. It was as much of a spectacle as it was a form of execution. And so why was Jesus whipped so brutally? Because Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, didn't think Jesus was guilty of a crime worthy of capital punishment. He didn't want to kill him. And the first thing he did, he sent him to King Herod, and Herod sent him back. And then he tried to trade Barabbas, and that didn't work. And so finally he has him scourged to within an inch of his life, hoping that when this bloodied hulk of a man came walking back into the courtyard, they say, okay, that's enough. You don't have to kill him. But that's not what happened, is it? And so now you have a man with, nail wounds in the wrists, a crown of thorns, scourging all over the body. And what does the scripture say? Now, Jesus gave up his spirit at around 3 p.m. Around 4 p.m, the Roman soldiers came back by, and because the high priest, because the next day was the Jewish Passover, didn't want anybody hanging on crosses during the Passover, and so they took a large wooden mallet and they broke the legs of both of the thieves on either side of Jesus, who were both still alive, and the breaking of the legs would speed the process of asphyxia, which is the inability to breathe. But what does the scripture say? But when they came to Jesus, they noticed he was already dead. Therefore, they didn't break his legs. The man on the shroud, the legs are intact. There's no evidence of broken legs. But what did they do further? They stabbed him in the side to make sure he was dead before they would release him to Joseph of Arimathea to be buried. And of course, from John's gospel outflowed blood and water. Probably not water, probably what appeared to be water, probably more likely the separation of blood and blood serum. Serum, when blood is no longer circulating and it's just sitting and blood collecting in the chest cavity, after about 20 minutes there'd be a separation of blood and blood serum. Outflowed what appeared to be blood and water, but was almost certainly blood and blood serum. And then the last anomaly, which is really enormous, is the fact that the shroud is a very expensive piece of fabric. It's made out of flax, which is expensive to start with. Many people were buried in shrouds made of wool or animal hides, but flax linen was very expensive. And not only that, it's manufactured in accordance with a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave, doable in the first century, yet expensive. And what does the scripture say? Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, purchased a fine linen cloth. So now you have a man who has clearly died a criminal's death, clearly been crucified, wrapped in a rich man's shroud. This just doesn't happen. And it's even a fulfillment of biblical prophecy in Isaiah 53:9, where it says he was assigned a grave with the wicked and the rich in his death. How do you do that? Crucifixion, criminal's death, in between 2 thieves, yet wrapped in a rich man's shroud, placed in a rich man's tomb. And so everything correlates. So forensically, if you ask, assuming that the image on the shroud is that of a real human being, and we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes, then there's no mistaken identity. There's only one person in all of human history who can correlate with all of those elements.
So thank you. That's a very good overview. So the summary here is the Shroud of Turin is a very ancient cloth that bears the image of a man whose wounds appear to be very consistent with the biblical story of Jesus Christ. And what that extrapolates to is there have long been claims that this is the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ, which for somebody who follows Jesus Christ faithfully, that's a very big deal. But of course, on the other side of that, you're going to have a whole horde of skeptics saying, first of all, biblical accounts may not be accurate. Secondly, who knows? This could be anybody. Thirdly, probably doesn't date to the right thing. All the usual objections that are usually made to any form of archaeological evidence that clarifies or supports Scripture tends to get attacked. My understanding of the shroud, which is very limited, is that it's unclear how this image even got on the cloth and what's really going on here. We don't have anything else like it. It's not like most burial shrouds that we find have an imprint of a body on them. But this one, and we'll put some in the video for those of you who are listening on audio. We'll have this on YouTube, and we'll put some images in. So if you're not familiar with the shroud or haven't taken a good look at it, we'll try to give you the opportunity to do that. You can see the clear outline of a human body on this cloth. And for centuries, there's been claims that this is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, and then counterclaims that this is some sort of hoax or fake. But nobody, from my understanding, nobody's been able to really explain how this hoax or fake could have happened. So, Russ, can you speak to what is the deal with the shroud in terms of what is this image? Can we recreate it? Is this could this have been faked? And let's get into some of the arguments and nuances about the shroud and what's going on with the shroud and why some people say it's not the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, or it's a clever fake that nobody knows when or how or why or who would have done that, versus your conclusions, which it seems like your general conclusion is that this is legitimately the valid burial cloth of Jesus Christ, which is a very big deal if that's true.
Sure. Well, let me just say that what you've just posed is as they used to say, the $64,000 question. Maybe it's with inflation, maybe it's the $64 billion question. But there is this either or proposition with the shroud, and it either is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus or it's not. And if it's not, well, then what is it? If it's not authentic, well, then it must be the work of an artist. It must be the work of human effort somehow, some way. Well, it's very important to know that not only is in my book, I call it the greatest unsolved mystery, it's also the most analyzed artifact in history. In 1978, you had a whole team of scientists, 33 American scientists, go to Turin, Italy, and they have access to this cloth for 5 days, working in shifts, round the clock, 120 hours. They bring with them 10 tons of equipment brought from various laboratories throughout the United States. And the name of the project was the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP as the acronym. And National Geographic did a big spread on this in June of 1980. There were articles coming out all the time about what the scientists had found and ultimately they released their results in October of 1981, and they concluded that the shroud image, or the shroud itself, is not the result of an artist. So what did they find? How did they come to that conclusion? Well, under all kinds of microscopy and spectroscopy and X-radiography and infrared thermography and all the tests that they did, they determined that there is no visible trace of any kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, or stain. There's no artistic substances on the cloth to account for the image. And so, yeah, there's random particles on the shroud. It's been around for a long time and been in display in cathedrals with all these painted murals all over the walls. And there's also, we know that there's at least 52 painted copies of the shroud. These are not forgeries. These are just, this is before the era of photography. And so someone would be authorized to paint a picture of the shroud, and then they would be laid onto the surface of the cloth to sanctify it, like Babe Ruth signing a baseball card. And it's and so this would and so the value of this copy, if you will, most of them are just awful. They're terrible. It's not even, you would, if it, the only value is the fact that it touched the real deal. And it's and so of course you're going to have random particles of this and that. They even found a particle of nylon. So are we to assume then that the cloth is made of nylon now? But here's the kicker. So not only is the image not the result of any kind of artistic substances, there's no discernible process that this alleged artist used either. And so and then on top of that, you have a whole pattern of blood stains. Well, is it just paint? Is it animal blood? Is it human blood? Is it blood from actual wounds? Well, yeah, it's actually blood from actual wounds. What we see on the shroud is the exudate of wounds. We see blood components. We see bile and bilirubin, hemoglobin, serum albumin, and bilirubin. I think I may have mentioned that. And so what we see, we don't see whole blood. In other words, it's not blood that was just painted onto the cloth. It's literally the exudate of wounds. And this bilirubin is really significant. It's a very high content of bilirubin, because that is a breakdown of the hemoglobin that occurs during conditions of severe stress. I think crucifixion might qualify. And it's so again, you get back to this either or proposition, and so okay, well, who is this artistic genius then who predated Leonardo by hundreds of years? We don't know who he is, we don't know how he did it, and he never did anything else. And so you have this either or proposition. And
Russ, I'd always heard that the contention is that because of the evidence that you just cited, that there was no artistic deposition. There was no process that we know of, that it was like the image had been energetically imprinted on the cloth as if it had been, stuck inside of a very high energy machine, like a high energy, a new process for creating a screen printing t-shirt or something. And that it had been energetically put on there again through a process that certainly didn't exist even in the 1500s, let alone in the first century, and something that we don't even do today. There was no other explanation besides something of that level that, from a religious perspective or from a Christian perspective, you would say, well, that feels like the very body of God being translated into heaven through this cloth, kind of a thing. But so I don't know if you've heard that one before.
Oh, I'm with you. These are all possibilities. It's when you look at it from a scientific standpoint, the old expression, can science and faith ever meet? Yeah, they did for 5 days in October in 1978, and science is still wondering. And it's and so when you as you said, let me just mention this. When you look at the shroud, you see a whole pattern of burns from a fire in 1532. It was kept in a silver box. The top of the box melted and a glob of molten silver fell down onto it, creating a series of burns. And so when you look at the image, when you look at the whole shroud, it appears to lie in between a pair of parallel lines, which are basically burns and scorch marks and patches from this burn incident. And it's fortunately it was considered miraculous because this occurred in 1532. It was in a chapel in Chambéry, France. It was kept inside of a niche. They had a metal grill over it to keep it from being stolen, and they had 4 locks with a different key. Well, that was great to keep it from being stolen, but not so good if you're trying to get it out of there in order to prevent it from being burned. And so, so they had a really hard time getting it out of there and by the time they did, the whole top of the box had melted and a glob of molten silver fell down onto it, creating this burn pattern. Well, anyways, the miraculous thing is that all we lost on the shroud was really the shoulders, and and so the image itself is fully intact, and but having said, so it was doused with water. So if you took the shroud and you flipped it over, so on the other side of the cloth, you'd see the burns, you'd see the water stains, you'd see the blood stains, but you would not see the image of the man. The image of the man is a purely superficial phenomenon affecting only the top 1 to 2 microfibers, not threads, microfibers. Each individual thread is made up of about 200 microfibers. So that means that this image resides on about 1% of a single thread, wherever the image is, and it's uniform in intensity. In other words, it's the same from the frontal image to the dorsal image. Anywhere you look at it, it's the same image intensity. That's ridiculous. There's no way that any kind of artist or any kind of human effort, and certainly in the Middle Ages, could account for anything like that. Now, maybe today, using modern technology, we could probably do something like that with some kind of a microburst on a laser, but you can't do it then. I mean, and so so this is the probably the most significant attribute of the shroud is its extreme superficiality. And yet the bloodstains soak all the way through it, which tells you what? Which tells you that there are 2 separate incidents. Now, what's also very important to know is that there's no image under the blood. If there's no image under the blood, then that tells you that the blood was on the cloth first, followed by the image. Well, that makes sense if it's authentic, Good Friday followed by Easter Sunday, but it makes no sense if it's the work of an artist. I mean, why would anyone in their right mind craft a whole pattern of bloodstains and then try to figure out an image to correlate it with? That would be ridiculous. And no one would do that. And so again, the mysteries related to this cloth are just astronomical.
So one of the arguments a lot of people have against the authenticity of the shroud is the dating, and there's been times where they carbon dated it, and I'm sure you can speak to the flaws in that. There's been some more recent dating methods that came out. I mean, even within the last couple of years that seem to actually support the age of it. So can you talk a little bit about just the dating of the cloth itself and why?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. The dating, of course, has been a conundrum for a while, and it was carbon dated by 3 different carbon dating labs in 1988, and it was given a date range of 1260 to 1390. And so I guess that's the end of this podcast. We can all go home, and it's but let me just, it's important to know what happened and what was supposed to happen. And they were supposed
just to clarify for the audience. So if those dates were accurate, then what that means is the cloth isn't old enough to have been Jesus Christ's burial shroud. It's 1,000 years too young. Give 1,200 or 1,300 years too young if those dates are correct.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. There would be the allegation is that it was a creation of the 14th century, and it's so let's just look at what happened and what was supposed to happen. They were supposed to cut 3 different samples from 3 different locations on the cloth. They didn't do that. They cut one sample from the outside corner edge, exactly where this cloth had been held and handled hundreds of times. Now you got to think, this is a cloth. Pretend I'm holding up a corner of the cloth. I'm standing on a platform, a wooden platform built specifically to exhibit the shroud outside in a courtyard. And so you probably have 5 or 6 other clerics of the church holding on to the cloth, and so that the people down below can get a glimpse of it and venerate it, observe it, analyze it, whatever they want to do. And it's And so this was done, this literal physical holding up of the shroud with hands what was done over 275 times between 1413 and 1694. And in 1694, it was installed into the church that became a permanent home for it, which is the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, which is where it is right now. But prior to that, it was held in these public exhibitions, physically held up by human hands. So if you were looking for the worst possible sample location, you would pick from one of the 2 outside corners, which of course is what they did. And it's and so now enter Ray Rogers, a theoretical a thermal chemist with the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and he begins to notice that there is an anomaly in that corner, that spectrographically it looks like there is different materials there, and so he obtains a thread sample from the main body of the shroud and compares it with a thread sample taken from that same carbon dating corner, and lo and behold, they're not the same. And my goodness, what are we talking about? And so he finds that there is cotton mixed in with the flax in that corner, yet there's no cotton anywhere else on the shroud. And there appears to be some kind of a madder root dye, that's MADDER, madder root dye on the cloth to perhaps blend in the brighter, newer cotton threads. There's a splice where the cotton and the flax are spliced into each other. And there's the presence of starch to stiffen the threads to effect some kind of repair. So it seems that we have all the ingredients for some kind of a medieval repair or reweave. And so now we don't even know what we dated. Is because when you take one sample and cut it into 3 pieces, I mean, 5th graders know that that's not the same as taking 3 different samples. So now the other researchers have gotten into the fray, because there doesn't appear to be any effort to carbon date it again. And so the first one was published in 2013. These are scientists with Padua University in Italy. They collected samples of other linens of a known age from the current era, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, all the way back to 5,000 years old. And they knew the ages of these other linens, either from their historical context or from carbon dating. And so they would develop a plot line of predictable chemical and mechanical decay over time with these other linens. And then they compared the amount of deterioration found in fibers from the shroud. And by comparison, they assigned a date range of 280 BC to 220 AD. That's a 500-year range with 1st century right in the middle. And then what's making the news right now is something analogous to that, which is called a new technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, which detects the amount of natural aging in linen fibers. And so I have this Liberato Di Caro, is with the Italian Institute for Crystallography. I have this little example that he gives. He's Italian, so he uses spaghetti as the example. And you take all these lengths of spaghetti. This would be what microfibers look like under a microscope, right? But over the course of time, they break. And so with aging, as they are subjected to heat, so the more heat, and so you get these little bits of fibers, as opposed to the full-length fiber when it was first manufactured. And so by looking at the amount of all this breaking in these fibers, you can determine how old the cloth was. And so the best linen, or the best sample that correlates with the amount of aging found in fibers from the shroud, that sample was taken from Masada, which is circa 55 to 74 AD. And so now we're beyond a 500-year range. We're putting it right at first century. And it's and so now that begs the question is who's right and who's wrong in terms of carbon dating. And so but I can tell you this, that I know for a fact that the carbon dating is absolutely wrong. And you can read all about it in my new book. Because it is a certainty that the shroud was in Constantinople in 1204 and stolen during the Fourth Crusade by the French. Well, 1204 is already older than the oldest carbon date of 1260. And it didn't just get there. It had been there for hundreds of years. And historically, it arrived in Constantinople in 944. So just historically, the carbon date doesn't fit. And now with these other testings, shows that something definitely is messed up with carbon dating. And it probably comes down to a bad sample. And it's, so there you have it.
And thanks for putting that together, because I know there was a lot of hullabaloo for a while about those carbon dating samples. And I'm certainly not an expert in carbon dating, but I imagine that being traumatically treated through fires and high heat and stuff like that would probably also throw off potential carbon dates. I want to get into a little bit more of some of the, and I don't mean this flippantly, it sounds flippant, but some of the so what. So, okay, so first of all, there's the historical significance of if the Shroud of Turin really is the original burial cloth of Jesus Christ, then first of all, that's a big deal that something like that has survived. But if it correlates with the gospel accounts that we have of Jesus Christ, then at minimum, it's a very, very important historical artifact, because it shows that this very old story is indeed accurate. And there was a guy and he was buried and he did suffer these traumas at his death. And then it shows that there's something particularly interesting that went on with the body, because there's no body in the shroud, but there's an imprint of it. And we're not entirely sure how that happened, some sort of weird high energy process that left this residual image behind. So there's that, which is also interesting. But then there's this other layer of interest that gets put on top of this. And you alluded to it, you used a couple of terms earlier that a lot of evangelicals may not be familiar with. You used the term veneration, for example, which our Catholic members of our audience will understand what you're talking about. But for somebody who's grown up in non-denominational evangelical church, they're going, well, what does that even mean? Does that just mean we're all impressed? But there's more to it than that. So I want to point to, for our more evangelical listeners or our more westernized listeners, then Acts chapter 19, verses 11 and 12 is a reference to this idea that there were miraculous things associated with objects that the Apostle Paul, in this case, had touched. And the miraculous things that happened were healings and the driving out of evil spirits. And it specifically mentioned, if Paul handled a handkerchief and then it was taken to a sick person, that sick person got well. Well, from that supports this idea of relics. And you talked about the idea of one thing touching an original relic, and the term for that is becoming a second order relic. I think I'm getting that right. Whereas the shroud would be a first order relic because it actually potentially touched the body of Jesus Christ. And depending on where somebody is in their faith and their faith heritage, then there may be an expectation for things being miraculously associated with the Shroud of Turin. So if this cloth touched Jesus Christ, then there would be some people would say, okay, well, that's probably the best relic ever, and we should therefore then expect some kind of supernatural results from the cloth being handled or touched or associated with other things. Are you familiar with any of that? Are there stories or rumors or any of these sorts of things where the shroud being the OG first order relic, is it are there claims made about it, or is it just purely historical significance as far as you know? And you may have your own personal journey on some of that. I'm curious if, these scientists that worked for days on that, did any of that come out? Are people saying, there was a before and an after when I touched a shroud, or give us some of the background or lore that surround these things?
I would say simply this, that the shroud is a, in my opinion, is a visual gospel. It's when you think of what the four gospels do, when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they testify to the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This is exactly what the shroud does. It testifies to the life, suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I want to give you an apologetic argument that's I think it's perfectly appropriate. This is from John chapter 20, verses 1 through 9. Early Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and found that the stone was already rolled aside from the entrance. She peeks in, sees that the body's gone, runs to find the apostles, and says to them, quote, "Someone has taken our Lord's body out of the tomb, and I don't know where they put him." So she thinks the body's been stolen or moved by somebody. Peter and John run down to the tomb. John makes a point of letting everyone know that he got there first. And then Peter, he finally arrives, but he goes straight inside the tomb, sees the linen cloth lying there. Then John goes in. He also notices the cloth lying there and believes. Believes what? Well, believes in the resurrection, because that's why they put soldiers out in front of the tomb, was because there was a rumor that Jesus was going to rise again from the dead, a rumor that Jesus himself started. And it's no wonder that when John saw this cloth laying flat on that stone sepulcher, that he would have said, maybe something interesting happened here. Now, but pay attention to this. John then becomes, with the linen cloth lying there, that is the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead. John becomes the first of the apostles to believe in the resurrection based on that evidence. So now the question is, was the linen cloth lying there in the tomb only for the benefit of Peter and John? Or was it for the benefit of the whole world throughout all generations? Now, how do you think God works? I mean, John 3:16, the capstone verse, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So I just think it's, now when you move forward to Acts chapter 1, verse 3, it says, after his suffering, this is Jesus, after his suffering, he showed himself to be alive through many convincing proofs. Now, most of those proofs were no doubt, after death appearances or post-resurrection appearances. And, but the first proof was the linen cloth lying there in the tomb. So why is it a stretch then to believe that the apostles would have preserved it, maintained it, passed it down, and it's in Turin, Italy right now? I mean, we want to make it seem like this is an impossibility, and yet it seems that why would you discard something that was the first piece of evidence that Jesus had risen from the dead? Now, the Jews may not have known what to do with it because it was covered with blood, made it unclean. It wrapped a corpse doubly unclean. Wait a minute. He was dead, but now he's not. So is it clean or is it unclean? And it's, and so tell you what, give it to the Gentiles and they'll figure out what to do with it. And it's, so I just think it's, very important. When I think of the shroud and how it, one of the most, I would say, I have to characterize how I phrase this objection because it's one that I find really obnoxious. But it's like, well, with arms crossed, I don't need the shroud for my faith. And it's like, Well, that's great, but that doesn't mean it wasn't meant for somebody else. I mean, I thought you call yourselves evangelicals. I mean, it's just amazing how evangelicals rarely evangelize, and yet here the shroud is this golden opportunity. Whether it doesn't have to prove it absolutely. It's just explore the mystery. As you explore the mystery, you encounter the message, and the message is pure gospel, and that's true whether it's authentic or not. And so that's been my approach for the past 40 years. It's like people ask me, well, what do you think? Do you think the shroud's authentic? And I'll say, I'm 95% there. I'll give 5% that there's, some alleged artist, like we said earlier, who predated Leonardo by several hundred years. We don't know who he is. We don't know how he did it, and he never did anything else. And it's, but man, you talk about something that is a presentation of the gospel. You can't get any clearer than the shroud.
Russ, can you share some of your journey on how you even got to? When you were a little kid, I'm assuming 6-year-old Russ Breault wasn't saying I want to grow up to be a Shroud of Turin expert. But what happened along the way, and how did you fall into this particular topic?
My dad was a professing atheist. My mother and dad both grew up Catholic. I'm from New England originally, and my mother maintained her Catholic faith. My father did not. He abandoned the faith. And when I grew up, literally, the sermon that I heard, he said, son, there is no God. Religion is fine for those who need it, but I see it as nothing more than a crutch for the weak. He was career Navy, so I saluted him and said, yes, sir, you must be right. And and so for the first 23 years of my life, I adopted his atheism. And, but obviously God had other plans. And so on my honeymoon, yes, it's true. On my honeymoon, I was in a hotel and in outside of Washington, D.C., and on the nightstand, not in it, on it, was a paperback version of the New Testament, and it was in the New Living Translation. It was placed there by the Virginia Bible Society. And so I tell people that I stole my first Bible. There was a little envelope there to leave a $2 donation to the Virginia Bible Society. I did not do it. And I still have that Bible even today. And so literally my wife had grown up Baptist, and I grew up nothing. And so we're literally driving up the East Coast. I live in Atlanta, Georgia now, and it's so we're literally driving up the East Coast, and so we'd switch off driving. I drive for a while, then she drives. Well, while she's driving, I'm reading this New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and I'm saying to her, "Did you know he did this? Did you know he said this?" I mean, I was intrigued by what I was learning about Jesus. I didn't know a thing about Jesus, other than he died on a cross 2,000 years ago, and how that, why was that even relevant to my life, and anyways, it took about 6 months of reading on that Bible before I came to the realization that Jesus was real. He is who he said he is, but he was not in me. I knew he could be. I had a friend of mine who witnessed to me back in high school, and he got hooked up with Campus Crusade and came home and gave me all these Bible tracts all the time. And I knew that there was one of them in there with a prayer. And so that was, so I came to faith, kind of through, a Bible tract and reading reading this, paperback New Testament. And, so then, now this, by the way, I'm dating myself. This is back in 1977. And so that's February of 77. In October of 78, you had this whole team of scientists go to Turin. Well, this is big news. Now, I was already a believer. I've got massively born again. I mean, whatever. I don't know what we call it, conversion, transformation, born again, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. I guess it depends on what branch of the church you're in. But at any rate, it was a transformative experience, and and so I was very excited about my newfound faith, but everyone in my family was unsaved except, well, my mom was Catholic, but all my friends, none of my friends were believers. And so I looked at this, I said to myself, oh my goodness, could there be an archaeological artifact related to the crucifixion and resurrection, a very bullseye of the Christian faith? Is that even possible? And so I got excited by the apologetic value of the shroud. I didn't need it for my faith. I was already a believer. And I was excited about how the shroud may open the eyes and the mind of other people to consider the claims of Christ. And I'll just give you an example of this. So I started, let me back up. So I gave my first presentation to the 8th grade boys in my church that I was attending in December of 1980. And so I've been lecturing on this. What is this now? Is that 44 years? So there's this Calvary Chapel church that I go out to fairly often in Salt Lake City. And so I went out there and I do these shroud encounters all around the country, and it's 200 images on the big screen. I walk the audience through what the shroud is, the history, the science, and then we explore the crucifixion based on the shroud, the resurrection based on the shroud, and then we finally get to the conclusion, which is I base it all on doubting Thomas, because that's why I think the shroud exists. I think it exists for the doubting Thomases of the world. But at any rate, so so I give this presentation in Salt Lake, and then I'm asked to come back out a year later. So I'm walking into the foyer of the church with the pastor. Shout out to Terry Long. And we're walking into the foyer of the church, and there's this woman standing there. And she's wearing a postal uniform, so she delivers the mail for the church. And she looks at me and she goes, I know you. You're the shroud guy. And I said, guilty as charged. And she says, well, I have something to tell you. And I said, well, I'd like to hear it. She says, well, when you were here last year, I gave my life to Christ, and my boyfriend who I was living with at the time, he gave his life to Christ. Now we're married and we both come to this church. And I said to her, what was it about the shroud that was so compelling for you? And she said this. It's beautiful. She says, it makes it real. That's it. It makes it real. And there are millions of the people in the world that have grown up in church. They've been to Bible school. They've been to Sunday school. They've been, maybe it's yet something didn't click for them. It just seemed, why does it matter to me about some guy who was strung up on a cross 2,000 years ago? Why does that matter to me? And of course, they don't know who that guy was. That might be helpful. And so the subtle evangelism of the shroud is really, really powerful. Not that I want anyone to place their faith in Jesus, solely based on the shroud, but if it can lead someone to consider the claims of Christ, then how is that not evangelical? And so I did another presentation this was up in Rhode Island. It was at a Catholic church. It was standing room only. And I come off the platform, and this older gentleman comes, he grabs me by the arm, he grabs me by the hand and pulls me close to him, and he says, I just want to tell you that I've been waiting 84 years for this day. Man, I'm saying to myself, something must have clicked. He's been to mass, he's been to services, he's been here, and nothing ever made any sense. And all of a sudden, you see it all come together through a shroud encounter. You're encountering the crucifixion and resurrection and the whole thing, and it clicked, just made sense. And it's so. At any rate, I'm not saying the shroud is for everybody, but I can guarantee you the shroud is for somebody. And it's, Paul, who writes and says, I became all things to all people so that by any means some might be saved. What about the second commandment about not making any graven image? Well, that's exactly why in the early centuries it was called, they described it as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands. It's like, we didn't do it. We don't know who did it, but we did not do this. And it's, but what's interesting is that, when Paul, he describes Jesus as the image of the invisible God, the express representation of his being, obviously something dramatically changed between Old Covenant and New Covenant. And, in the Old Covenant, no one ever saw the face of God, not even Moses. And yet in the New Covenant, everyone sees the word of God made flesh standing in front of them. And we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And so is it conceivable then that this cloth was left here for a reason? And, speaking of, we're all, people are watching the Chosen and Jonathan Romy with the long hair and the full beard. No one's going to have a picture of a short-haired Jesus on their wall. It's never going to happen. Where does this notion of long hair, full beard, large hollow eyes, long flattened nose, where does this come from? Comes from the shroud, all the way back to the 6th century, and the Orthodox call it the true likeness, the image not made by hands. It's and so there's a reason why even today we stylistically understand Jesus to look exactly like the man on the shroud.
So Russ, I have a question about that. So the image on the shroud, I guess there's 3 things that you're seeing, right? You see the burn marks. You've talked about where the burn marks came from. You see the blood. It seems pretty obvious where the blood come from. The blood would be on any burial shroud of somebody who had wounds while they were buried. But where does the image itself come from? Like, what is your speculation on that?
Well, there was some experiments done in the 2000. It was published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2011. Some Italian physicists were working with high energy pulse lasers and excimer lasers, and they determined that a 40 nanosecond burst on a UV laser against a control sample of linen achieves the very same depth and coloration as we see on the shroud. Remember, it penetrates the cloth only 1 to 2 microfibers, and the image is not the result of substances. It's a result of what's called an accelerated dehydration and oxidation of the cellulose fibers, and so it's essentially a yellowing of the cloth. So he's able to achieve the same depth and coloration with a microburst on a UV laser. This is the first time we've been able to replicate any aspect of the shroud image using light. Now, this is a really cool piece of data, is because the best explanation for what happened to Jesus in the tomb, if you ask the question, what happened to Jesus in the tomb? Well, there are no eyewitnesses. Now, there's a good reason, because there was a big stone put in front of the entrance. So if you're going to ask that question of what happened to Jesus in the tomb, you're going to have to answer it by looking at other verses of Scripture. And so the first clue we get is the Mount of Transfiguration. This is before the crucifixion, maybe 6 months or so, where Peter, James, and John are at the bottom of the hill. Jesus goes up to the top of the hill, and he says, and he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun itself, and his clothing became dazzling light. So here Jesus is described as a being of light before the crucifixion. And then how does he appear to Saul, who becomes Paul on the road to Damascus, rounding up those renegade Jews who were believing in this Messiah. And it's and all of a sudden, Jesus appears in a flash of light so bright that Saul is thrown down to the ground, and he's blinded for 3 days. And so just do a straight Bible study. Ask this question: what happened to Jesus the very split second his soul came zooming back into that lifeless body? I think you'd have to assume that there was an explosion of light and then gone. And then, so the cool thing about this laser technology is that the best explanation for what happened to Jesus in the tomb comes from 1 Corinthians 15, verse 52, where Paul not talking about Jesus, talking about us right here and all believers. He says, behold, I show you a mystery. We will not all sleep. That means to remain dead, but we will all be changed in the twinkling of an eye, in a flash. For that which is corruptible must put on incorruptible. That which is perishable must put on imperishable. And so Paul is talking about an instantaneous transformational event that occurs at the end of the age. Hasn't even happened yet, but that's exactly what happened to Jesus in the tomb. Now, how do we know that? Because Jesus is called the first fruits of the resurrection. If he's the first fruit, then that means we are the rest of the fruit that comes later at the end of the age. And I'm saying that's cool. And it's, so I always, Joel, you and I met at the prophecy conference, right? And, so why would they want me at a prophecy conference? Is because part of the message of the shroud is prophetic, is that it speaks to a future event. When you're looking at that shroud image, you're looking at a snapshot of the resurrection, in my opinion. And so is that then a snapshot is that a picture of our future glory? Remember, when Peter, James, and John saw Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, he saw Jesus in his glory, but that was a prefiguring of our glory as well. Is that, so there's coming a transformation, and different denominations will call it various things, whether it's the catching away, the gathering together, the rapture, whatever you want to call it. But there's an event coming, and and I'm kind of looking forward to that myself. I don't know about you, but and I think the message of the shroud is past, present, and future. It speaks to a past event, which is the physical resurrection of Jesus from the dead, a historical event, not some myth or allegory. A future event which you've already talked about, but in the present, it speaks to the price that was paid, and that's a big deal. The price that was paid.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for sharing your personal story. I'm trying to imagine you're on your honeymoon, this transformation beginning, and your wife going, wait, who did I marry? I thought I married that guy, and now I got this guy over here, which it sounds like was a positive transformation. So good for her. I sometimes joke my wife's been married to 4 different men, and all of them are me. So it's but I like the direction you went with that, because I had asked about kind of the relic perspective and some of how people expect those miracles, and you're describing a much more meaningful, miraculous transformation that comes about as a faith process when people stop and consider the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ being a real historical event, and that the shroud is able to raise those questions to force people to consider it. And it sounds like that's the thing that gets you really excited about the Shroud. It gets me excited about it as well, by the way. And you do a great job relating that even over video here. That when we have to stop and consider, wait, Jesus was a real person, and these things really happened, and he had an actual body that suffered and died, and then it rose again, and that these other disciples who were real people went to their death saying that it happened. When we have to stop and consider that from something besides just theory or religion or, well, those are nice stories that make us feel better, when it comes into this real thing, and then as you're describing, points to the future, that if that's true, and if Jesus isn't a liar, then it's not finished yet. And we are on a trajectory towards a similar transformation that he enables by his grace that he's calling us to. Then suddenly this walk of faith, this Christian walk is no longer just well, this is my principled way to live. It's, well, this is how I have to live because it's what I actually believe I am and what I'm doing here and where I'm going. It informs my day to day and my moment by moment, because Jesus Christ is a real, actual living being who has relevance to me personally. And it's not theory anymore. And so the Shroud is sounds like it's a really great taking off point for that conversation to say, okay, well, let's look at this thing. What do you think about this? There's blood on it. Where do you think that blood came from? And as people raise their questions, and I think it encapsulates a lot of people's faith journey, where they start with some awareness of the Christian faith, but they kind of have these preformed dismissals. But over time, through experience, and as God chips away at those things, that they realize, oh, my dismissals aren't as valid as I thought they were. Oh, I'm running out of reasons to reject this. And then eventually you get to a point where you go, maybe this is real. and the Shroud is a kind of a microcosm of that faith journey. So thanks for sharing that. And you're welcome to share any more comments on that front. I did want to ask you, I've personally never seen the Shroud with my own eyeballs. I've seen photographs of it and stuff. If somebody today said, well, Russ has me convinced, I got to see this thing. What is that like today? Does that happen? Can somebody go see it? Is it on display somewhere? If so, what is that experience like? Or obviously your book would be a great piece of reading material on the plane ride over to Italy or wherever this thing is kept. What do you recommend for somebody who goes, I got to learn more about this? And are there other things like the Shroud that should also be considered if somebody says, hey, archaeological evidence is what scratches my itch? What do I need to know?
Well, archaeologically, which falls into the realm of apologetics. This is the capstone, in my opinion. I mean, it's, I'm hoping one day we'll actually fully excavate a 400-foot long boat, 7,000 feet above sea level in the mountains of Turkey, but is it conceivable that the burial shroud that wrapped the crucified and risen Son of God could be sitting in Turin, Italy right now? And it's well, you'd have to wait for a public exhibition in order to see it. The last one was in 2015. We thought that the next one would be next year in 25, but I actually don't think so. Ever since 1983, it was willed to the current living Pope. And it's prior to that, it was owned by the various kings of Italy all the way back to 1453. And it's but when the last king of Italy, who was exiled from Italy after World War II, he went to live in Portugal. And when his only son decided to get married in Las Vegas, he says, well, I can't give this cloth to my son. There's no telling what he'll do with it. And so at that point, he willed it to the current living Pope. So Pope John Paul II had two exhibitions on his watch, and the Pope Benedict the 16th? Anyways, had one on his watch, and then Francis had one on 2015. But I think Francis is pretty old and ailing, and I think he's going to punt to the next pope. And so my guess is probably maybe 2030 at this point, if we're all still here.
Yeah, so. which we're all starting to wonder about, and we talk about that a great deal on this podcast. So, Dan or Brian, before we let Russ go, any final questions? And then Russ, I do want to make sure before we wrap up, I want you to get a chance to let people know where they can find you and more about you. But first, I'll pass the mic to Dan and Brian if they have anything additional to add or comment for the recording here.
I mean, I just remember because in 1977, 78, 79, right? That's when I was entering into junior high. And I remember that article. My mom collected National Geographics. I remember that Shroud of Turin thing coming out, and it was fascinating, even though I grew up in a non-Christian home, no, introduction to anything relating to the Bible. But I was absolutely fascinated by that. And so then whenever, articles come out, I'd read about them. And so kind of knew about the different dating controversies. And I think the most interesting one is how the scientific community at the time had said, carbon dating, it's from this time period. But it was like you said, historically, we know where the shroud was for hundreds of years. They tracked it meticulously. Even when the French stole it, they know who stole it, where they took it, where they stored it. Like, there was no doubt that the shroud had chain of custody, regardless of what the carbon dating had come back for. So there was always some question about the veracity of that finding. But I just think it's an amazing thing. And the whole idea of relics, like you were talking about, first order relics, second order relics, Joel, coming as a young man into Christianity, evangelical Christianity, that's not even a thing, right? We don't have relics. We don't talk about that, even though it's been a tradition in the Orthodoxy for, a couple thousand years. So it's just another whole facet of the way that God is interacted and dealt with people over the centuries. And not all of us have the same experience or the same background, but it just shows that God continues to meet people where they are, and as a strong apologetic reference to people to just hold on to, just like that lady told you in front of that church in Utah, I think you said, where she's like, it made it real. And I think for a lot of people, they need that kind of in your face. You got to know this. This is the same intellectual battle that a lot of us fight continually. You have the person that says, well, God said it, I believe it, it's good enough for me. And there's a lot of us that are like, God said it, I really want to believe it, and I'm going to keep researching until the Holy Spirit actually changes my heart to make it real, which is where I think most of us sitting on this podcast have been in our lives. That's all. Thanks so much, Russ, for
thank you, Brian.
It's been wonderful.
Yeah. So my closing thought would just be, we know from Scripture there was a shroud, right? The shroud is very obviously talked about. So somewhere out there, the shroud exists. Is this one in Turin it or not? I mean, the evidence seems pretty darn strong. Ultimately, it doesn't change whether or not this is the one. Doesn't change anything about the fact of who Jesus was, his life, death, resurrection. But, for someone who is already a believer, when you look at the evidence, it can certainly be one of those things that can strengthen our faith. I think where everyone, when we're honest, is somewhere like the Father in Mark that says, "Lord, I believe, help me overcome my unbelief." Right? Like even when we believe, we are always kind of fighting to be strong in our faith. If we were perfect in our faith, then we wouldn't sin. We would just perfectly trust God. So, looking at things like this can help us kind of strengthen our faith in those ways. For the unbeliever, I hope you take this seriously and dig into it and look at what it means and, really wrestle it to the ground. Like, is it for something that cannot be reasonably explained as a fake or a forgery? Are you willing to just write that off completely? Right. Or are you willing to to use this as a reason to dig into who Jesus is, and to make a decision on that, because it is the most important decision you'll ever make in your life, is deciding, do you believe Jesus was who he said he was or not? And so, I hope for the unbeliever listening that you can take that seriously. And thank you so much, Russ, for sharing, for the book you wrote, for the time you've put into it. And thanks for joining us.
I want to share one thing with you that I think will help a lot of people in your audience, because there is the confusion over relics. And of course, you have a piece of bone. How do you know it's the bone of Saint so-and-so? How do you know? But when you have something that's measurable and testable, like the shroud, like Noah's Ark, like the Ark of the Covenant, no one would ever call these things relics. They are archaeological treasures. And it's so first of all, let's get the whole thing about relics. I don't place any stock in relics either. But the shroud, you wouldn't call it's just another relic. I mean, you'd never say that about the shroud. So but the other thing is also in. I want to tell you what the shroud is. Now, there are 4 words that are commonly used to describe the shroud. It's called a relic. It's called an artifact. It's called a mystery. It's called a symbol. And those words are fine, but they really don't tell you very much. So I got to thinking, there has to be another idea, another concept. So I searched the scriptures for all the words that describe what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross. And there are 4 of them. We, as believers, have been bought, purchased, redeemed, ransomed. What are those words? Those are all words of transaction. A transaction has occurred. A payment has been made on our behalf. So I got to thinking, well, when you go to a store and you purchase anything, you're making a transaction. And when you give the money to the cashier, what does he or she always give you in return? A receipt. Right? What is a receipt? It's a record of the transaction, right? What's on the receipt? The price you paid. So when Peter and John ran to the tomb and saw the linen cloth lying there, what did they see? They saw the record of the transaction. They saw the receipt. And when they opened it up, what did they see? They saw the price that was paid. They saw evidence of the crown of thorns, scourging all over the body, wound in the side, nails in the wrists, I mean, everything that was paid to purchase our salvation is on the receipt. So what does it mean? It means that we have been purchased, we belong to Christ, and we have a receipt stamped in blood that says paid in full. And this is a really important understanding, is because when you describe, because there's an evangelical concern that people would worship a relic. Why would you worship a receipt? When you understand that the shroud is a receipt for a purchase that was made 2,000 years ago, a payment that was made on our behalf. So not only is it a receipt, but as we spoke earlier, it's a promissory note for that which is yet to come. So it's a document of a historical event, and it's also a document of a promissory note for a future event that is yet to happen. But hopefully it's coming soon. And so I think understanding the shroud, because when you call the shroud a relic or an artifact, it means it's almost meaningless. When you call it a receipt, you're bringing it back to a theological concept that we have been bought, purchased, redeemed, and ransomed for a purpose. And so I just think that's a very powerful understanding of what the shroud really is, why it was left in the tomb, and why it has been preserved for all these centuries.
Well, that's a beautiful and poetic way of capturing it, and I'll probably work that into the title for this episode somehow. So thanks for that gift. It's very helpful, and I think a really powerful way of thinking about it. Russ Breault, this has been a wonderful conversation, tell our audience where they can find you, where they can learn more, where they can keep digging if this has lit up some circuits for them.
Well, I highly recommend the book. It's only 256 pages. It's not daunting. It's got 75 pictures in it, and it's going to go soup to nuts. It'll cover all the bases, but I promise it won't bore you. And it's my website is shroudencounter.com. You can bring me to your church or I'll do a whole 90-minute extravaganza with 200 images on the big screen, and it's so you can find me at Shroud Encounter on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, and of course that's my website and the name of my book. And so thank you so much for having me on.
Well, this has been wonderful, and as I often do with our guests, I want to thank you for faithfully carrying out the work that the King has given you to do. He's clearly put you at a place, at a time, and with a certain passion and a certain set of skills to be able to do the work you're doing. And it is making waves in the kingdom. And if you weren't being obedient to that, then we wouldn't all be able to sit here and benefit from it. And the thousands of people that will hear this as a result wouldn't have the opportunity to really reflect on the things you're saying. So thank you for doing that. I know it's a lot of work, and I'm sure there are the ups and downs, and the some days are better than others as you try to carry this out. Writing a book, especially a book on a controversial issue, is hard work. It's just, there's just no shortcut to it. So thanks for putting that together, and we'll certainly link to it. And we recommend our audience get this, give it to your friends, give it to people who are skeptical, give it as a conversation starter, have it on your shelf, carry it in the airport, whatever you need to do to get people asking about it. Because that's a great thing about the Shroud, is anybody who knows anything about it has an opinion, and anybody who doesn't know anything about it is going to be immediately curious once they hear what it's supposed to be. So it's a great conversation starter. Russ,
as I say, explore the mystery, encounter the message, and so you don't have to prove that it's absolutely the burial shroud of Jesus. I just think it could be. So let's explore the mystery, and as we do, we encounter the message of the gospel itself. And so it's just a phenomenal way of doing it. And everybody can be a student of the Shroud. Hey, have you read this book yet, or you ever heard of the Shroud of Turin? It's a great conversation starter, because you can't talk about the Shroud without talking about Jesus. That's impossible. Yeah. And so that's just a very cool way. And I think maybe it was preserved for this time in human history. You got to wonder why things happen. Why is all this news circulating right now all about these shrouds? Maybe God's getting us ready for something. I don't know.
It's almost like we all have to come up to speed on something.
So you never know. So anyways, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It's been a
Thanks,
joy.
Chris.
And audience, thanks for joining us for this episode about the Shroud of Turin with Mr. Russ Breault, and we look forward to the next episode.